an American entertainer and teacher, perhaps best known for his role on the children's TV show Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, is reflecting on his career that sparked a national conversation.
For 33 years, parents thought they knew exactly what their children were watching when Fred Rogers walked through the door, changed his shoes, and began talking to puppets. But Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was doing far more than entertaining children. Every detail that looked completely ordinary had a purpose, and some of the show's most powerful messages were hidden in plain sight. So what was Mr. Rogers really trying to teach? And what did millions of children absorb without even realizing it? Join us as we pull back the curtain on the hidden genius of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. The man behind the cardigan was not who anyone thought he was. Fred Rogers walked into children's television in 1968, looking like the least complicated person who had ever appeared on a screen. He had a gentleness that made everything around him seem calm. The image was so disarming that almost nobody looked behind it to ask what this man actually was. What he actually was is remarkable. Rogers graduated from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary with a bachelor's degree in divinity in 1962 and became an ordained Presbyterian minister in 1963. He then attended the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Child Development, where he began what would become a 30-year collaboration with the child psychologist Margaret McFarland, one of the most respected minds in developmental psychology of the 20th century. He was also the musician who composed every song on the show himself, over 200 of them across the program's run. He was a puppeteer who voiced all of the main characters in the neighborhood of make-believe. He was the show's chief writer. He was its executive producer. He was the face in front of the camera and the entire intellectual architecture behind everything the camera showed. Rogers' biographer Maxwell King described him as the genius behind the most powerful, beneficial programming ever created for very young children, and went on to note that he was simultaneously a fearless crusader for higher broadcasting standards and a technological innovator operating decades ahead of his time. The origin of the show says everything. Rogers initially entered the television world not to perform, but to fix something. He saw a man throw a pie in another man's face on an early broadcast, looked at what commercial television was doing to children's minds, and decided that someone needed to build something different. He used every credential he subsequently earned to build that something. Nothing about the program that eventually emerged was accidental. Every element was chosen with a reason, and most of those reasons were invisible to the audience watching, which is exactly how Rogers designed it. The man who appeared to be the simplest presence on American television was running one of the most sophisticated psychological operations in its history. And the place that operation was most precisely engineered was somewhere that nobody thought to look, in the show's opening 30 seconds. So, what happened in the first 30 seconds? The architecture of a child's trust. Watch the first 30 seconds of any episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and you are watching something that looks completely ordinary. A man comes through a door. He sings a song. He takes off his jacket, puts on a sweater, changes his shoes. It takes maybe 90 seconds from entrance to the moment he actually starts talking about anything. For most of television's history, producers have considered every dead second of airtime a catastrophic waste. Fred Rogers used every one of those seconds on purpose. The entrance was designed to track left to right, specifically because that is the direction children's eyes naturally move when they begin to learn to read. The movement was not about drama or visual interest. It was a daily rehearsal of reading comprehension encoded into a children's program in a way that required no one to notice it was happening. While Mr. Rogers is tying his sneakers and zipping his sweater, children have the opportunity to settle in. That settling in was not a side effect. It was the point. Rogers and McFarland had discussed the neurological reality that young children cannot absorb information while simultaneously managing the transition from one environment to another. The shoe change was a decompression chamber. It gave children's nervous systems the time they needed to stop being in wherever they had been before and to arrive fully in the neighborhood. Every day, without variation, with the same sweater and the same sneakers, until the ritual itself became a signal to the brain that it was safe to open up and receive. All the transitions from room to room, from place to place in the neighborhood, and especially to make-believe, are handled with purpose and care. Rogers understood that unpredictable transitions cause anxiety in young children, and that anxiety closes the mind rather than opening it. So the show had no unexpected surprises. You always knew what was coming. The trolley always went the same way. The neighborhood of make-believe was always accessed the same way. The return to the real world always happened the same way. The predictability was not laziness of structure. It was the structure doing its job. Monday knows. The pace of the show is the element that most adults have always found baffling. The program was conspicuously, almost defiantly slow. Rogers was informed by his coursework at the University of Pittsburgh, by pediatricians including Dr. Benjamin Spock and Dr. T. Barry Brazelton, and by McFarland. All of them understood something that commercial television producers either did not know or did not care about. Fast-moving stimulation does not teach young children. It overwhelms them. A child whose screen is moving too fast to process is not learning anything. They are simply being managed by the experience rather than engaging with it. Rogers chose slowness as a competitive advantage, not a limitation. The show's unhurried pace allows children the chance to process what is being presented, the opportunity to make connections, and the space to concentrate. The pauses that made adults restless were the precise moments when children's minds were doing the work. The silence was not empty. It was full. And then there was the eye contact. Rogers had a practice of turning to the camera and holding eye contact with his audience for durations that made adult viewers profoundly uncomfortable. They felt stared at. Children felt something entirely different. For children, the eye gaze mimics their earliest interactions with their parents and provides a supportive moment. A child being looked at directly and held in someone's gaze is experiencing something neurologically similar to what happens during secure attachment with a caregiver. Rogers was using the technology of television to produce a physiological sense of being seen and cared for. In children who did not have that experience reliably at home, the effect was particularly profound. The sweater itself. Rogers' mother Nancy knitted every cardigan he wore on the show, every one of them, for the entire run. That detail is not trivia. It is the physical manifestation of the show's central philosophy, which is that everything visible on the screen carried meaning, and that meaning was always about care, continuity, and the presence of someone who would reliably show up. And showing up reliably is exactly what made the most dangerous moment in the show's production history, when Fred Rogers walked alone into a Senate hearing room, into one of the most consequential 6 minutes in broadcasting history. The 6 minutes in a Senate room that saved an entire institution. On May 1, 1969, President Richard Nixon's administration was proposing to cut the federal funding allocated to public broadcasting from $20 million to $10 million. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which had been created just 2 years earlier by President Johnson to provide non-commercial educational media, was in genuine jeopardy. Without the funding, what public broadcasting was attempting to build, including Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which had only recently been nationally syndicated, would be crippled before it properly started. Fred Rogers went to Washington to testify before the Senate Commerce Subcommittee on Communications. Senator John Pastore of Rhode Island chaired the committee and was a famously impatient man. He did not know who Fred Rogers was. He had not seen the show. He was midway through a long day of hearings, and he was not inclined toward warmth. At the beginning of Rogers's pitch, Senator Pastore appeared dismissive and skeptical of this unknown speaker before him.
Senator Pastore, this is a philosophical statement and would take about 10 minutes to read, so I'll not do that.
Rogers had prepared a 10-minute written statement. When he sensed Pastore's impatience, he put it down. He chose to talk instead. He told Pastore what the show was about. He spoke in the language he spoke on television, quietly, directly, without performance or salesmanship. He said he wanted to give children a sense of their own value, that feelings are mentionable and manageable, that a child who has been told he is loved and special is a child who will not need to spend his adult life proving it through violence or destruction. And then he recited the lyrics of a song he had written for the show, a song about the different feelings that children carry, the mad feelings, the sad feelings, the feelings that arrive without invitation and refuse to leave. He recited it slowly, in the Senate chamber, to a man who had been skeptical from the moment Rogers sat down. Senator Pastore, visibly moved, admitted, "Well, I'm supposed to be a pretty tough guy, and this is the first time I've had goosebumps for the last 2 days. I think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful. Looks like you just earned $20 million. The entirety of what became PBS, Sesame Street, Nova, Frontline, everything, has its roots in a funding moment that was secured by a man who knew that speaking from a genuine place was more powerful than any argument he could have made from a piece of paper. The thing nobody talks about when that testimony is discussed is that what Rogers did in front of Pastore was exactly what he did every day on television. He looked directly at another human being and spoke to that human being's actual emotional state rather than their public position. He held the space and waited. Pastore, who was 58 years old and had been in the United States Senate for 15 years, experienced in 6 minutes what millions of children experienced every time the trolley went to make-believe. He felt genuinely seen, and that feeling changed everything he was about to do. What Rogers had built was not just a children's television program. It was a method, and that method worked on senators as well as it worked on 5-year-olds, because the need to feel genuinely received does not have an age limit. But the most surprising element of what the show was doing was happening in a part of the program that most adults dismissed entirely as silly. The puppets were not entertainment. The neighborhood of make-believe is the segment of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood that adults have always found easiest to ignore. A small model kingdom operated by visible puppets with visible strings and fabric that bunches at the wrist where the handler's hand is clearly inside the figure. Nothing about it is technically impressive. Nothing about it was ever intended to be. Fred Rogers' wife Joanne said that Daniel's striped tiger pretty much was Fred. That observation was more precise than it sounded like a casual remark. Daniel's tender voice confided, "Sometimes I wonder if I'm a mistake. Maybe I'm too tame. I'm not like anyone else I know." These were not lines written for a character. They were the internal life of a man who had spent his own childhood feeling isolated, different, and unsure of his place, processed and given voice through a tiger living in a clock with no hands. Rogers had deep roots in psychology. His mentor McFarland had told him repeatedly that anything mentionable is manageable. The problem with mentioning difficult things directly to young children is that directness itself can be threatening. A child who is asked point-blank whether they are afraid of their parents divorcing is being asked to occupy an emotional position that may feel dangerous. There is nowhere to hide in a direct question. But a child watching a puppet ask whether it is loved, whether it matters, whether its anger makes it bad, that child can hold the question at a safe distance while their nervous system processes it fully. Rogers was using the neighborhood of make-believe as what child psychologists call a projective space. The puppets were doing emotional lab work. King Friday the 13th, with his self-importance and his resistance to change, was processing the psychology of authority and control. Lady Elaine Fairchild, with her social aggression and her tendency to disrupt, was processing the feelings that arise when someone does not feel fully accepted. Daniel's striped tiger, shy and always asking the questions children were too afraid to voice out loud, was the interior life of every child watching who had ever felt too different, too small, or too much. Puppets create emotional distance while maintaining narrative intimacy. Rogers used them to discuss divorce, death, jealousy, and fear. This method is grounded in Jungian archetypes and play therapy. This is not a description that Fred Rogers would have offered for his own show on camera, but it is accurate, and it is what McFarland and the consulting child development professionals on the production understood was happening every time the trolley went through the tunnel. The trolley itself was doing something too. The trolley serves as a transition. A clear and careful distinction is drawn between what's imagined and what's real. Mr. Rogers is never present in the neighborhood of make-believe. This was a deliberate developmental choice. Young children, between the ages of 3 and 5, are in the process of building the boundary between fantasy and reality, and that boundary is fragile. Rogers never blurred it. He went to the edge of make-believe and sent the trolley in. He stayed in the real world. When the trolley returned, he was there to receive the children and reflect on what had happened in the kingdom. The structure was a lesson in ontology, in what is real and what is imagined, taught through a model train without a single word of explanation. And one night in June 1968, the night before Robert F. Kennedy was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, a puppet appeared on television and asked a question that every child in America was carrying and that no adult seemed to know how to answer. What does assassination mean? The puppet was Daniel Striped Tiger. The man behind the puppet was Fred Rogers. And the question was posed in the exact space, make-believe, where children had been taught it was safe to process anything that felt too large for the real world. That was the genius of the neighborhood. Now here is what nobody expected from the gentlest show on television. There was a moment in 1969 when it became the most politically radical thing on the air. 2 pairs of bare feet in a plastic pool. The summer of 1969 in America was a summer of racial tension so palpable it had physical weight. The Civil Rights Movement had won its legislative battles, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, but the culture had not caught up to the law. Swimming pools were battlegrounds. 5 years earlier, in St. Augustine, Florida, a motel manager had poured acid into his own pool while black and white protesters were staging a swim-in to protest segregation. The Supreme Court ruled that year that public pools could not be segregated by race, which meant that in 1969, the question was still before the nation's highest court. Into this context, Fred Rogers wrote a script for an episode of his children's show about a hot summer day and a plastic wading pool in his front yard. Rogers invited an African-American police officer, played by actor Francois Clemens, onto the set. At a time when black people could not swim alongside whites in many public places, American audiences witnessed Rogers and Officer Clemens wash their feet in a small plastic swimming pool.
NBC5's Adrian Pastor is live this morning. Adrian, a lot of people remember Officer Clemens from the show and the role he played in talking about race at the height of such a divided time.
The scene is almost unremarkably simple. Rogers is cooling his feet in the pool. Officer Clemens comes by. Rogers invites him to join. Clemens hesitates. He doesn't have a towel. Rogers offers to share his. They sit together, their feet in the same water, talking about the heat. When Clemens has to leave, Rogers dries Clemens' feet with the towel, then uses the same towel to dry his own. This seems benign today, but the stark contrast of Fred Rogers' white feet and Francois Clemens' black feet in the same pool was a profound response to incidents of racism at swimming pools in the 1960s. Clemens himself initially did not understand the full weight of what Rogers was doing. He understood it later. The brilliance of the scene is that it worked on multiple levels simultaneously, which is the only way Rogers ever operated. For the children watching, it was a hot day and 2 friends were cooling their feet. There was nothing threatening, nothing declarative, nothing that required a child to process the scene as political. It was just normal. 2 people, same pool, same towel, same ordinary summer moment. That normalcy was the message. A depiction of integration so casual and warm that it bypassed every defensive response and went directly into a child's model of what the world looked like for adults watching. And for the historical record, it was a direct and deliberate counter-image to every act of violence at public pools that the decade had produced. That is Fred Rogers operating at the full extent of what he understood about how change actually happens, not through confrontation, but through the normalization of what ought to be normal. Was there a particular episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood that stayed with you? A moment that you understand now meant something different from what you thought it meant as a child? And knowing what you know now about what the show was really doing, does it change how you feel about it? Share your thoughts in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.